Hello. So I thought I would use this as an opportunity to consider, or put to you to consider, sort of feminism and generational change in the context of MeToo, and sort of think, is there actually a right way to consider, to define feminism? What should feminist politics look like, and how does sexual culture fit into it? Now, that's kind of a huge terrain, and so I'm just putting it out there to keep in the back of your head. So Me Too is something that I mean, as a journalist, as well as an academic, I was very kind of interested in what was happening with Me Too beyond just a kind of the personal and political levels. And it struck me that, that there should have been a real generational continuity with Me Too. Because it was at its core about the personal and the political. The idea that, you know, women's rights is not just about legislation, it's about what happens to women's bodies on a day-to-day basis, what happens at the bus stop, what happens at home, what happens at work. And in that way, it sort of seemed a child of the 1970s women's liberation movement, whose rallying cry was the personal is the political. And you know, one of the things that I study as a scholar with my historical hat on is a feminist magazine called Spare Rib, which some of you may remember. And you know, Spare Rib was hugely important to a lot of women, but it was still considered a little bit of a kind of loony left niche feminist thing. And if you speak to all kinds of people, they think, oh God, Spare Rib, yeah, that was for kind of weird feminists. But you know, in Spare Rib, accounts of harassment come up again and again. And it's sort of interesting that it's siloed, you know, it's considered a sort of niche concern, but they're talking about the experience of going to the pub, and there's outrageous, you know, descriptions of just the simple act of being a woman going to the pub. Experiences at work that we would, you know, that are far worse than most of the things that most of us, thank God, experience now. But this is still, you know, this is the mid-70s, this is still kind of like weird, you know, nobody cares. Another source that I've studied a lot is definitely not a feminist magazine. It's another magazine called Singles Magazine, and it's for single people, and it ran from the 70s through to the 90s. And it was sort of catered to sort of single, quite angry, small c conservative men, actually, and women, but there were a lot of sort of male readers in this community. And there would be kind of one very memorable reader, a woman, wrote in saying, you know, in detail, these absolutely horrendous experiences of being kind of assaulted at the Victoria and Albert Museum, you know, yelled at for not going to bed with someone who bought her 2 martinis, or so on, really kind of outrageous. And the response to her, the magazine intervened and, you know, said to her, stop being so shrill and ridiculous, you're kind of, you know, so silly, what do you expect, kind of thing. So that's actually 1977. So my question then is sort of why then, given that the women whose feminism was forged in this environment of the 1970s, on one hand, the sort of personalist political rallying call of the women's liberation movement, and the kind of actually horrendous day-to-day experiences women were experiencing, why have they in some ways turned out to be the most critical of Me Too? And for me, one of the, you know, this generational clash has emerged as the single kind of most interesting theme. And I think, you know, actually, you know, we saw that in France as well, which I'll return to. So just to kind of move to what these critiques were. Older feminists who came of age in the 70s, some took the stance that this was not actual feminism. Me Too wasn't really politics. It was sort of a weakened, kind of pushing a sort of weakened, victimized form of womanhood, which was about sort of deferred complaint. And Germaine Greer, who I'll get to in a sec, you know, she even said that the victims, some of them, of Harvey Weinstein had sort of asked for it by almost, it was almost a contract that they'd entered into, and then 20 years later or whatever, complaining. I mean, that, you know, she was very against that. So there was something about Me Too that really pissed off some of that 1970s generation. And to me, it's something about what counts as politics and political feeling and political causes. So just to now move to Germaine. I don't know, maybe some of you remember in detail what her critiques were, but I think they are interesting because they were they were so outrageous, they were seen as being so outrageous. and the other thing to note is that they weren't, she said them in the most outrageous possible way, but they weren't that different from what a number of older academic women from that generation were telling me in private. So she wanted women to kind of take care of the situation then and there. And it was about sort of toughness. So she said she always wanted to see women react immediately when faced with harassment. In the old days, she said, there were movies, like the Carry On comedies, for example, which always had a man leering at women. And the woman always outwitted him. He was a fool. We weren't afraid of him, and we weren't afraid to slap him down. So, and then she said in the Sydney Morning Herald, this now famous interview, which she kind of slightly denied later, but she definitely said all this. What makes it different is when the man has economic power, as Harvey Weinstein has. But then, as I said before, she then said, if you spread your legs because he said, be nice to me and I'll give you a job in a movie, then I'm afraid that's tantamount to consent. And it's too late now to start whinging about that. So I was very interested in this word whinging. And again, I want to sort of keep that word in the room to consider in relationship to feminism and what emotions are okay to drive feminism is what sort of difference between whinging and anger and just, that word seemed extremely kind of loaded to me. Especially in light of the fact that one of the most pervasive ideas of generational change now is that the younger generation, millennials, are kind of snowflakes, that something has kind of happened and young people can no longer handle criticism or sort of life's tough knocks or anything like that. We take offense at nothing. And I actually have to say, I think there is some truth in that critique. Whereas, though, so millennials or snowflakes, our elders had sort of courage and grit. And I think there's actually kind of something there's like an Anglophone tenor to these ideas about grit and just, individualism and taking things as they, in your own terms. And obviously Germaine Greer is Australian, but that's still Anglophone. But she, this idea that a man touches up a woman and the grittier, our foremothers would sort of punch and swear and not then do what we would do, which is maybe defer, send an accusing tweet, and then claim that we've been traumatized. So again, ask the question, how should whinging relate to politics? Is whinging just a sorry substitute for anger? Can a movement be based on whinging, understood however you want? Or should we be thinking more about how anger was such a transformative emotion for the women's liberation movement? Maybe anger is more productive. So just, drawing to a sort of close nearly, just to gloss a couple of other people who had criticisms. So there were some North American feminists who are older, again, who criticized MeToo, especially in light of North American universities' zeal for sort of opaque disciplinary hearings for any member of staff, usually men, accused of sexual misconduct. And there were some quite high-profile cases of this where due process had been completely suspended, seemingly. Laura Kipnis, quite a well-known film studies professor at Northwestern University, I think she was extremely interesting in her critique. She expressed similar ideas to Germaine Greer, but slightly more subtle terms, where she sort of was saying that the way Me Too had been handled and combined with how university campuses under Title IX, which is about sexual misconduct and whatever, it's an American thing, ruling. She was saying that this sort of hothouse atmosphere around sexual aggression was actually making women victims. It was depriving them of the opportunity to be resilient and robust, so there was a sort of in seeking to protect women, Me Too, and that Me Too culture was actually making them more vulnerable and more kind of passive in a way. And her book is called Unwanted Advances, Sexual Paranoia Comes to Campus. And I think it's really worth sort of looking at. Margaret Atwood, another famous example, also expressed concerns about the threat of mob rule as the Me Too movement gathered momentum and the urge to bypass a legal system which people sort of thought was, or started to see as broken. And the previous year, she had been accused of being a bad feminist Again, what constitutes a good feminist? What's a bad feminist? She'd been accused of being a bad feminist for calling for due process for a University of British Columbia professor who had faced allegations of misconduct, and he had just been sort of dealt with behind closed doors. It was unclear if any of the accusations had been founded. It was just they'd been made, and that was the end of his career. And in speaking up about that, she opened herself up to a lot of abuse. And now, we might consider the different emphasis of the French response, seeing as this is a panel about sex, I suppose, a little bit. And so just I don't have the deepest knowledge of the French response to balance ton porc, MeToo. But I did, everyone knew about that letter that Catherine Deneuve signed, one of 100 people, to Le Monde. And the emphasis there, interestingly, was on the perceived threats to the joys of seduction. So it was a more sex-focused critique than the Anglophone one, as far as I could tell. So that letter said that Me Too represented a puritanical wave of purification, that rape is a crime, but trying to seduce someone, even persistently or cack-handedly, is not, nor is being gentlemanly a macho attack. So, my own research interests kind of have always been around how major shifts in sort of the gender order, including political shifts like the women's liberation movement, have impacted on dating, or male-female, heterosexual relationships is my kind of area, male-female kind of quest for romance. So how does feminism change the quest for, how does that change how men and women are relating to each other in the romantic field? So I'm wondering, final thought in future, what will historians be saying when they tease apart the effects of Me Too? Because I think it's too soon to do that now. How did Me Too change and reparcel or reshape gendered relationships in general, but also romantic relationships? Thank you.